You're listening to A Second Look on the Orca. A second look is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on past events, unpack their significance, and discuss their long-term implications. A second look is intended to give thoughtful reflection on issues that made the headlines and elicited strong responses as a society. What did we think then? What do we think now? What have we learned? And now, your host, Justin Goodrich.
Welcome to the premiere edition of A Second Look here on the Orca. I'm your host, Justin Goodrich. I'm incredibly excited to be hosting this new podcast here on the Orca and would like to begin today's edition of A Second Look by thanking McLean Kay, Editor-in-Chief, for inviting me to join the team. A Second Look is unlike any other program here on the Orca. Rather than addressing what's making headlines today, this show is about revisiting events that have made the headlines in recent months and unpacking those events in a thoughtful and reflective manner. On the premiere edition of A Second Look, we'll be taking a second look at Black Lives Matter. More specifically, the events of May 2020 that triggered a host of protests throughout the United States and Canada last summer and well into the fall. My guest for this edition is Judy Lewinson, a writer, director, and producer. Some of Judy's most notable works include Emmy-nominated and Parents' Choice Award-winning television series Hip Hop Harry, official Sundance selection and Peabody Award-winning documentary Budo, and Hollywood Black Film Festival winner Tiger Man, Fathers of the Sport, an examination of the history of professional basketball and the legends who played the game, featuring both Penny Marshall and Julius Dr. J. Irving. Now, Judy and I met back in the late 1990s when we were touring the province, doing interactive presentations in elementary and high schools on issues, including racism, as well as bullying and sexual exploitation, and we've maintained our friendship for over 20 years. I'm incredibly honored to have her as my very first guest. Welcome to the program, Judy.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
Well, Judy, let's delve right into it. The Black Lives Matter movement elicits a lot of very strong emotions and very strong opinions. As a black woman who has been a champion for social justice your entire life, someone who has toured this province speaking on racial justice causes and events such as the Women's March and the Me Too movement, tell me, what does the Black Lives Matter movement mean to you?
The Black Lives Matter movement, for myself personally, is just about expanding a conversation. It's about amplifying the voices of a community that is frustrated. It's about amplifying the voices of allies who are also frustrated, and seeking accountability for things that have been happening throughout North America specifically, but also around the world. We're just seeing a lot of discrimination where the level of justice is clearly different depending on your melanin content.
Interesting way of phrasing that. So, Judy, if you were to explain the Black Lives Matter movement, perhaps a little bit more poignantly, break it down for me in just 2 or 3 sentences. What does someone have to understand about it?
The simplest way to truly address this would be to say, in order for all lives to matter, Black lives should matter too.
Interesting that you say all lives matter. Now, this is something that I think you and I, given our backgrounds, have a better understanding of. But there are a lot of people who have argued, well, of course Black lives matter, and in fact, all lives matter. And I think some of them say it from a good place in terms of the intent, which is, well, of course, all human lives matter. But in doing so, by saying all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter, I think does a serious injustice to the notion of Black Lives Matter. Can you help someone who, perhaps this is their first time giving some, in-depth thought to the notion of Black Lives Matter? Can you tell them why saying all lives matter isn't the appropriate response?
It would be about really, I would ask that individual or those persons who say that, why do you feel the need to have that retort as your instinctive retort? Similarly to Blue Lives Matter, do you respond the same way, saying all lives matter? If the answer is no, then that is where the conversation has to get far more serious. And it's not a conversation that I have to have with that person. It's a conversation that that person has to have with themselves, because what they are saying and any actions associated with that will be the true testament of their intent on the matter. All lives matter, certainly. However, until Black lives matter in the same level and equity as the all lives that they are referring to, there is a discrepancy in saying all lives matter at this moment. They do not all matter equally. And that is any headline, any day, any city in North America, and often throughout the world.
And I appreciate you contextualizing that in the context of mattering equally. I think that's an important delineator in the conversation that I think is lost on some people, and I appreciate that clarification. One of the other things that I've been hearing a lot more recently is that the Black Lives Matter movement, I don't want to say doesn't have a place in Canada, but it is seen and people have perceived it as a very Americanized type movement where acts of violence are more profound, negative interactions between law enforcement and members of the Black community are more profound, more lives are lost. It's really, sort of southern U.S. So, is it not just a sort of a political football here in Canada, something to, a bandwagon to latch on? Now, again, I'm asking the question based on what I'm hearing. Those aren't my views. My job as the host, though, is to share some of these opinions and get your feedback as someone with lived experience. So what do you say to someone who says, you know what, it's just an American thing and it's just being politicized here in Canada?
I appreciate the question. I also appreciate the way you framed it, in that this is lived experience as opposed to people who just say, if you don't see something and you don't experience it, take it outside of the context of any sort of social justice. If you don't have cancer and you've never experienced cancer, do you say that cancer doesn't exist? Or is it a better thought to say, well, you know what? Somebody is saying that they have cancer. Someone is saying that they need help for this cancer. Perhaps we should look into addressing the issues surrounding cancer, because racism is a cancer. It is a unruly, unforgiving cancer that is running rampant. And there are ways to, if we're going to play the parallel comparison, find radiation to eradicate the disease. But you have to choose to actually do the work and therapy for us to recover.
Well, then, Judy, that really leads me to the crux of our conversation today, which is, so what needs to change? How do we eliminate racism? I mean, we are a country, I think, filled with it. I think without question, our treatment of Indigenous persons certainly reflects that in terms of our country's history. But racism in all sorts of forms, whether it's against members of the Black community here in Vancouver, we've had as a result of COVID, huge attacks on the Asian community, because it was known as the quote unquote, Asian virus or Chinese virus, and the result of that, I mean, people being victimized, buildings, being spray painted, and so on and so forth. So I don't think anyone can argue that racism is a reality. How do we curb it? How do we address it, Judy? You've been at this for over 20 years. Tell me about your story and give us some insights.
Well, honestly, I don't wake up to fight racism. Racism exists. I am a woman of color, and so I experience it at various levels. Some of it is very subtle in employment places, banking, so forth. Some of it is very, very overt. I've had a man try to stab me on the street while using incredibly disgusting racial epithets, and I was literally just trying to park my car. I had parked my car and was trying to pay for my parking at a meter. He just popped up out of nowhere. So I'm not really fighting. All I want to do is live. And so the answer is, for how do you stop racism? we could go back to the days of children. What do we teach children? Treat people the way you want to be treated. That is the simplest way. However, the more intense labor is to, when you see something, not only say something, but do something to dismantle the racism that you are seeing. Whatever the form it is, however it presents. If you're in a room and there is nobody in that room that represents these other groups that are saying we are being locked out, speak up. Use your position and your place and your voice to ensure that that doesn't continue to happen. In this world now, there is no "I'm not racist." That is the racist person's response. I'm not racist. I don't see color. I don't understand when people say they don't see color, because traffic lights have color and people seem to be able, for the most part, to stop their cars when it turns red. Side note, traffic light created by a black man.
Okay.
Let that hang as you wish. However, I want for people to realize that it's not for the persecuted to solve it. It is for those who are in company with, or are with people who are overtly racist, and are in company with systems that are racist as well, and breaking that down, altering it, changing it, providing options. Include people of color in those conversations, of course, because nobody wants someone to come in and tell us, well, we've done this now, so everything is fine. What we want is for honest action immediately.
You know, it's you've touched on a couple of really interesting things here. I think one of the first things you've touched on is this notion that it's everyone's responsibility, and rightfully so. We as citizens, as fellow human beings, we all need to engage these issues. We need to raise our voices to them. We need to take action. You know, myself as a member of the gay community, it's funny. We have people that I identify as allies, and I say it's funny because there have been times where I've even seen people wearing T-shirts that say I'm an ally
Right.
with big rainbow flags,
yes.
and it makes me smile, and it's appreciated that they're making themselves known as allies. I'm wondering, looking back on the events of May 2020 and the subsequent protests, or more aptly put, I'm sorry, the subsequent rallies, especially ones here in Vancouver, do you feel that the black community is gaining more and more allies, or do you feel that, do you feel that there's progress being made, or do you feel that this further divides where we're at? Because I've heard both sides of the argument, which is, well, they're self-evident. So tell me a little bit about that. Do you feel like the black community is gaining the allies that they rightfully should have?
I believe what we're seeing is an amplification of the voices of existing allies. We are also seeing the education of those who thought they were allies and have learned that you can't just put up a black post on your Instagram, a black square. Hashtags do not save lives. You need to actually be in I don't want to say the fight, but you must be in the conversation. You must be within the movement. I've now started to say to people, I'm really not interested in allies. I have a lot of friends. That's great. What I want is an accomplice. I want someone who's going to get into the foxhole with me and by any means necessary dismantle the system that is killing people, violently killing people. People need to understand that a black woman was asleep in her bed. The police came in, they shot up her apartment or house, and the only charge that was filed was for the bullet that missed. If this was your favorite pet, the police came in, they shot up the place, killed your animal, but the only charge was for the bullet that didn't kill your dog, you would be outraged. If it was your child, you would be outraged. Why is it such a difficult concept to grasp when it's a human being whose complexion and cultural background is different than yours?
Now, I wholeheartedly respect what you've just said. Playing a little bit of devil's advocate, going back to this original notion of U.S. versus Canada. Now, full disclosure for our listeners. Academically, I'm a criminologist. My background is international criminal law. My focus was on counterterrorism and the international criminal courts. My stepfather is a retired Vancouver police detective, 39 years, 29 with the VPD, 11 with the military police, nicest, sweetest, gentlest guy on the planet. I have a whole host of connections to the law enforcement community. So when I think back to people who have argued as to the manner in which Black Lives Matter is politicized, I think, well, here in Canada, our law enforcement officers have far better training. There are far more lethal force type incidents statistically in Canada. Some of the atrocities that we've heard about in the United States don't seem to mirror Canada to the same degree. And I'm pushing you on this a little bit because the example you're using is a US one. And so where I'm going with this, Judy, is how does the Black Lives Matter movement intersect with law enforcement? Because it seems to be very anti-law enforcement. And my contention would be that there is in every profession, there's 3 to 5% of people that ought not to be there. There are some atrocious police officers, no doubt about it. There are people who are educators, people of, involved in the religious community, business leaders. There's always people. But it feels to me like as part of the response to Black Lives Matter, we are painting all law enforcement with a single brush, which is all cops are bad, all cops are violent. And I don't believe that. So tell me, and I know you have some connections, of your own to members of the law enforcement community. So again, part of this is me playing devil's advocate, but tell me, how do you reconcile those two things?
For listeners, they should know that Justin and I have these type of conversations all the time, so I appreciate actually being able to do this on the record. I know that you don't mean to push me in a way to be like, are you kidding me? There will be no flying off the handle here. I understand that our conversation is for the edification and benefit of the listeners, as well as it's always great just to have these chats.
Judy, in 20 years, you are one of those friends where we can unpack some really challenging things for the betterment of not just improving as human beings, but improving as members of the society. So I thank you for your comments, and I'm so thrilled we're doing this.
Exactly, yes. So to address your question, the initial sort of response to this movement says that all cops are bad, and that's not fair. We saw statements like that from law enforcement fairly soon after the peaceful protests and some of the marches. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, it's only been a couple weeks and they're tired of being stereotyped. So does that provide them more empathy and edification for an entire group of people who are constantly being misrepresented in media and in real life with these stop and frisks and on television? They're always the criminals. Minor things, even if you watch scripted programming, the manner in which arrest happens of a person of color versus a non-person of color, subtle differences that are being constantly communicated. Imagine not just your lifetime, but generations of that happening. If this movement does anything to enlighten the empathy and edification of those who do not like being painted with that single brush, that it moves them to not just become allies, but accomplices in rooting out the bad members of your team, then we must really consider that as a win. Any move in the right direction. If I play on a team and I want to win a championship ring, but there's one guy who is determined to shave points, there's one guy who's determined to ensure that we lose and we don't get that win, why is he still on our team? Why are we not addressing it? You would never just let the bad player carry on. It's one, and I know that people are saying, well, it's talking about Canada versus the U.S. let's remove the United States from the conversation. Canada, in and of itself, each province has its own identity, has its own culture, and its own manner of doing things. People choose to live where they live based upon the experiences that they're most likely to have in different portions of the world, of the country. As a result, you can't paint even all police in Canada with the same brush, because we see instances that happen on the East Coast far different than incidents that happen on the West Coast. You know, you mentioned your stepfather, who I am sure is a very, very lovely man. You said he's the sweetest man on earth. I have to say, you've never met my father. We can talk about that later, because I think he is the sweetest man. But, but here's the thing. Both men can exist in the same world together and be equally sweet. And so if we look within, say, our immediate Vancouver Police Department, I have had reasons to be in contact or relation with the police since I was in high school. The very first time, the police department sought me out to give me an award for doing community work that helped get young people off the street on Friday nights. I didn't ask for it. They didn't know at the time that I was a black person, I don't believe. It was brought to their attention, and there was no, oh, well, we just won't do it anymore, etc. It was, here's an award for a good job done. I have also seen experiences that don't make the paper that are happening in Vancouver. In recent years, however, I've also seen within the Vancouver Police Department work being done to remove persons who are not performing to the oath that they took to protect and serve their community. And this isn't a white or black thing. This is a good officer versus a good officer. And the swiftness and the transparency for when those things happen, I would encourage the law enforcement, not just VPD, but RCMP, et cetera, in the different districts throughout the province and the country, to be far more transparent with how, if a mistake was made, okay, but what are you doing to clean that up? But don't just hide that there was a mistake made, because the community still talks. And that is what will then breed this mistrust, whether it's within the black community, the LGBTQI community, the East Asian community, the South Asian community, European communities. What we want to really see ultimately is all lives mattering equally.
And there's the crux, equally, which is, Judy, you were just so eloquent.
Well, thank you, sir.
I love that I can ask a question, and I ask it in some bits and pieces as I'm trying to generate it in my head, and then you so eloquently answer it. I so enjoy this. For our listeners at home, we so of course this is the premiere edition of A Second Look, and the premise is that we look back at events that have taken place. Now, Judy and I, we're recording this in the middle of January 2021. It was in our calendars for a while to have this conversation. And it's only been in the past few days, less than a week now, where we have seen the riots at the United States Capitol building. And of course, this too, in addition to being concerning in its own right in terms of, an attack on democracy and so forth. And I know this goes a little bit the grain of what's this notion of a second look and looking back at something historical, but we've just had a moment where it's in our face again. So I'm going to take some liberty on this first episode, and I'm interested in your comments about that, because in addition to the attack on democracy, there are the elements of white supremacy, and there are comparisons to responses in terms of, the events at the Capitol versus how protests have been handled in the Black Lives community movement. And forgive me if I say protest and I mean rally, and
I think at this point our listeners know what you're asking, and that you do not mean any sort of offense or anything. The language here it is important, And that is something that even off after we are done here, we'll always continue to, adjust languages and carry on in that manner. But it is also important, if our second look only happens to be from 6 days, because it is being related to things that were our initial topic of conversation, it's important that we include that in this conversation, and it would be disrespectful not to, out of respect for just the conversation we're having between each other, but also to our listening audience.
So, and I thank you for that, Judy. And so let me then ask the question. There is a belief that there's a disparity in terms of the response to the events of the Capitol in the United States versus a response to Black Lives Matter events that have taken place. Tell me what this means to you. Tell me what you think, how you feel, what this signals. I have my thoughts and views on what it signals. They're not very positive, so I'll keep them to myself for now, hoping that you might shine a little light if there is one at the end of the rainbow.
Well, I always believe that there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, so we will pursue that until we achieve those riches and enrichment in humanity. The discrepancy that we're seeing in this conversation of, had it been black people, this is what would have happened. And then you have others saying with a retort, well, they didn't set anything on fire. And that is a sort of a bait and switch response, rather than focusing on, let's talk about the initial response once the alert went out that an incident is happening. So speaking of marches or protests, rallies, something that you saw, and this is easily, you can Google it, TikTok, Facebook, whatever your favorite form of social media is, you will see immediately people marching with their hands up. And the immediate response is very, very aggressive, pseudo-military riot gear, lines to push people back, corral them. You also saw things like the pallets with the bricks being laid out and just popping up mysteriously. And when some in uniform, some plainclothes persons putting them out, when they were caught on camera, asked, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" Suddenly there was a "I've been caught" expression on their faces. These responses happened within the few hours after a march or a protest has started. And again, these are people with their hands up. So at this point, it is 100% peaceful. There's not been a robbery, there's no fires, there's nothing like that. If in that few hours, sometimes few minutes, you can have such a visual response and such an aggressive response, someone needs to explain and hold wholly accountable the persons who failed to protect, yes, the physical capital, but also democracy, when in the weeks prior the date was given and there was no armed presence to shut down the road leading to the Capitol building. There was nothing. What we saw instead were officers that were helping people in and out. What we saw instead, and have since learned, is there were many persons who have sworn an oath to serve and protect, using their badges to help people get into places that they should not have access to. What we saw were people entering the offices of those who have been elected to serve and protect democracy being vandalized and abused with grins. I have never seen people take their phones to take selfies while causing destruction. I don't understand that.
It is bizarre. It was so bizarre to watch.
still shudder at the footage I saw of a law enforcement officer who has since died being pressed and crushed by that crowd. If the lives of these officers matter, why would you do that? I don't understand why, even within the time that this is happening now, we know that when it was people of color and allies and accomplices saying, hands up, don't shoot, you can assemble so quickly. When officers were calling for help, at this point now, it's not even, okay, there's insurrectionists carrying on. There are officers calling for help. Where was the help?
You know,
if all lives matter and blue lives matter, they didn't equally that day.
Well, extraordinarily well put. And I mean, I think it speaks to, I mean, you and I
mean, I could go on, but that is
no.
It's too close for the full second look. I'll come back for that.
You'll come back, and undoubtedly 6 months from now we will unpack this. But you know, I think you and I can agree that like racism is just stupid, and I get it intellectually, but in my heart of hearts, I don't understand it. I mean, I was raised to treat everyone equally. You talked earlier in the show about it starts with their kids. I look back at, my closest friends growing up, Chinese, Black, Middle Eastern. I don't even think I had a white friend until I got into high school, frankly. But it didn't matter. It never mattered. They were just my friends, and they were my boys, and that was that. Mm-hmm. So in my heart of hearts, I've never understood racism. But when I look at the events of the Capitol, not only do I see the stupidity of racism, but I see the hypocrisy of, in some ways these double standards, the quote unquote, as you say, blue lives matter, but then where was the backup for the police? Meanwhile, there are others that need to be held accountable, including the president, who instigated so much of this. But all for another episode,
time, yeah.
Another time. What I do want to close on, though, is just you've talked a lot about the importance of everyone standing up, making their voices heard, taking a stand. I was so incredibly proud of the rallies that took place in Vancouver. I attended one of them as an observer, and was actually quite pleased by so many things: the peaceful nature of it, the interactions between the Vancouver Police Department and the general citizenry. I think we just have so much to be proud of in Canada, but we still have a long way to go, and I recognize that. So in that spirit, by way of a final comment, Judy, any final thoughts, any final ideas, any next steps? A listener finishes the show today, they're feeling compelled, like they want to be part of the solution. Just give them a nugget, an insight, which I undoubtedly know you will.
Well, first and foremost, I'm so happy you brought up about the rallies held in Vancouver that were organized by a young man named Jacob, who is the grandson of an absolute legend, in my opinion and the opinion of many others, Nalda Callender, who runs the National Congress of Black Women here. And just that relationship alone shows you how it takes generations to do the work. And how Jacob, he has had not a good experience with a police officer. And that is his story to tell. And I definitely encourage you to have him as a guest on your podcast. However, he channeled his energy in a way that did not dissipate the urgency, and also provided space for those who say we're doing the work, including law enforcement, to show that. You will be judged by your actions, not your words. And so even as you say, in Canada, I want us to break it down even further. In Vancouver, in Coquitlam, in Port Moody, in Langley, really, when we hear about the engagements between police officers and members of the community, let's really find out, well, who's responsible for that person? Who is the training officer? Who is the commanding officer? Who is the chief? Also, who are the people on the city councils? Everyone must know that they are accountable to the people, and some of that accountability will be made shown at the ballot box. Some of it will be made shown through peaceful marches and rallies, and some of it will be made through people having their own channels, like a podcast, outreaching through media, etc. But telling the full story, the whole story, is very key. There's so much we could say about the subject. I'm really proud of Jacob. So I know that that's not really the question you asked, but it sort of summarizes that it takes all of us. It takes all generations. It takes us deciding that we want to be better and then be better. No options. Nike, just do it.
Just do it. Judy, I want to thank you for being my guest on the premiere edition of A Second Look here on the Orca. It's been an absolute delight, and I'm so very thankful for the ability to have this candid conversation with you. So thank you so much, Judy.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to continuing our chats. The first 20 years have been kind of cool, so I think I'll keep you around.
All right. I appreciate that. Well, that does bring us to the end of the premiere edition of A Second Look here on the Orca.ca. Until next time, I'm Justin Goodrich. Thanks for listening.
The preceding program was brought to you by Alliance Public Affairs Group in association with Van Grio. If you have any questions or comments about today's episode, please email us at asecondlook@theorca.ca. Thank you for listening, and please remember to like and share.